because of that. Personally, I have never smoked, and aside from coffee and a glass of wine with my evening meal, I do not use any mind-altering substances. However, when I ran a marathon in 1980, I discovered the buzz that exercise produces due to endorphins, a morphine-like substance that our own brains make. And through exercise, I still enjoy that. The point I have in mind here is that mind-altering substances are a fact of life and have been for millennia in various cultures and religious rituals. The big issue is how do we manage and use these substances? I in no way condone the recreational use of these substances, and yet as soon as I say that, I become a hypocrite because of my alcohol and caffeine use. My father used to say, "Do as I say and not as I do," and he smoked cigarettes and drank too much at certain times. Many children in our time face a similar issue when their parents use marijuana, but also a double issue because marijuana is illegal and they then see their parents breaking the law, or worse, they decide the law is an ass and they develop a disregard for it and may go on to use the substance themselves. In the USA, 1 in 9 children have a parent in jail. And the USA, with its mandatory minimums, has the highest incarceration rate of any country. Predominantly, it's due to drug charges, and the majority of which are for simple possession. When we attempt to wipe out all use of a substance that some people will always want to use by prohibiting it, that is, if we use prohibition as the controlling factor, we then face a predictable set of unintended circumstances that we have seen all too clearly in the past with the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s. The product goes underground, price, purity, and profit are controlled by the criminals, and there is a tendency for politicians, police, and prison officials to become corrupted. Violence increases as gangs fight it out for control of the market. We, the taxpayers, pay the costs. It has been said that profits are privatized and costs are socialized. Clearly, when we prohibit, we lose the ability to manage. And as far as solutions go, another saying that I think is pretty good is that there are no good solutions here, only least worst ones, or least bad ones. As I saw the drug war unfolding over the last 40 years and saw the horrific effects of prohibition, I began to educate myself, especially in the last 6 years, about what was happening, not only internationally, but in my own hometown. Scanning our local paper shows about 2 marijuana grow-ops busted per week, and there's no sign of that lessening. This happens while criminal investigations in general in Vernon continue to fall. In 2011, the figure was 8.8% down. In Vernon, we've had our own gang-related shootings with the Greeks gang, and internationally, Mexico and the Central Americas are facing horrendous murder rates. Mexico has lost something like 40 to 47,000 people in the last 8 years in the drug war. The cost worldwide is now of the order of $320 billion per year, and the USA has spent $1 trillion since President Nixon declared illegal drugs the #1 enemy in the country. Marijuana is the second largest contributor to the BC GDP at approximately $7 billion. When we quote these numbers, though, you have to remember that how do you really get statistics when it's illegal? Nobody really knows. So that $7 billion is second, it's behind construction and in front of forestry. A huge, untaxed underground economy. It became clearer to me that the real issue is our drug policy and not necessarily the drugs themselves. It's not to say drugs are not dangerous and addicting, but our drug policy is creating huge harm. I was moved to get active in seeking policy reform and began to speak out on the matter to local organizations and groups. I interviewed a local drug squad member, and he confirmed that about 80% of local crime was drug-related. And a police superintendent said that when we get into murders, as we had with the Bacon brothers in front of our Kelowna Grand Hotel, the cost goes up to about $1 million a murder. I also found out that there are many organizations active in seeking drug policy reform, not only in North America but internationally. This past 12 months has seen major appeals for change coming from several directions. Examples are the report from the United Nations Global Commission on Drugs, which declared that the war on drugs is a failure and called for legal regulation and repeal of prohibition. The signatories to that report included Kofi Annan, former UN Secretary General, plus several former heads of state, in particular those from the Southern Americas, who have borne a heavy price because of the drug war. We also have had the letter from 4 former mayors and current mayors of Vancouver. And then we've had the BC Public Health Officers Council report. And most recently, the 4 former Attorneys General of BC came out publicly in favor of legal regulation, taxation, and management under a public health framework. The Vancouver mayors, the BC Public Health Officers, and the former BC Attorneys General have all endorsed the work of Stop the Violence. Stop the Violence BC, with its solid credentials and evidence-based approach to reform, provides a way that we can all get involved in making the voice for change heard. It is hoped that these panel presentations can be made throughout our province, and tonight is the first one that has been held out of the Lower Mainland. Finally, I would like to say that we need to try and reconcile with those who say that legal regulation is wrong and that prohibition should be maintained. We certainly have a commonality, and that is that we would like to see recreational substance use become minimalized and that those who abuse find the treatment they need and the help. If we allow evidence to guide us, I think we can make progress together. In conclusion, there is a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. that may help us all to spur us on to some more activity in dealing with this issue. He said, "Our lives begin to end the moment we become silent about the things that matter to us." So thank you all for being here, and we're going to hear from our main speakers next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Evan Wood. Evan is one of the founders of Stop the Violence BC. In addition to all the other work he's done, he has spent a huge amount of time on this effort and continues to be a real voice for reason and leadership in this whole field. Evan is has a PhD in epidemiology. He then went to medical school. He has a medical degree and is a specialist in internal medicine, and has made major contributions in research in the HIV/AIDS area. He is a real expert on this whole subject of changing marijuana legislation. It's a great pleasure to welcome Evan to Kelowna. Evan.
I thought I might have to interrupt you there if you kept going. So thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's really nice to be in Kelowna. I have family.
Closer to your...
Sure. I have family in Kelowna, so really nice to be here. And I'll just get right into things. Obviously, this isn't a pharmaceutical talk, and I have no conflicts of interest to declare. And obviously the reason that we're here is to talk about the problem of organized crime and gang violence that we've all been experiencing in the province. And this is a pretty typical headline, but if you scrutinize it closely, this is actually going all the way back to 2007, where it was concluded that there wasn't just one gang war, but there were 4 gang wars happening. This isn't just an issue that's relevant to Vancouver. It was just across the street that a famous gangster was killed, as alluded to here. The same type of thing has been happening in other parts of the interior, and you know, I can go actually on and on with these headlines, which have really actually migrated to page 3 now. It's not even front page news when someone gets shot in one of our communities. And, you know, really the police have been saying the same thing that we've been saying for a long time, is that, you know, they describe marijuana and the marijuana industry in BC as the jet fuel that's driving organized crime in this province. And there haven't been a whole lot of academic discussion in this area for some time, but I have to give recognition to the Fraser Institute, because I don't like it when the marijuana thing gets politicized as a right-wing or a left-wing thing. And everyone in the room will know that the Fraser Institute tends to be sort of a center-right, fiscally conservative organization. And they concluded in their analysis that the cannabis industry was between anywhere between $2 and $7 billion annually. And you'll see their conclusion: if we treat it like any other commodity, we can tax it, regulate it, and use the resources the industry generates rather than continue a war against consumption and production that has long since been lost. So that was 2004. And really, I think the public health community, while all this has been happening, has been sort of sitting on their hands, as implied by this cartoon, where you can see a professor standing at a podium saying, while limited, we may have some emerging evidence that might point to the slight possibility that maybe the war on drugs is not optimized, though I can't say this with certainty, and more research is certainly needed. And I think that has been the posture of the public health community, where people have been unwilling to really talk about this issue in a transparent way. That's really changing in that the war on drugs is actually really being entrenched in Canada right now. We're talking about building mega prisons and mandatory minimum sentences for very small drug law offenses. And you're starting to see people come out of the woodwork to talk about this. Now, I'm not going to bitch and moan, as alluded to by this New Yorker cartoon, but I'm going to present some data to you here. If there's one image that you maybe take home with yourself tonight, it would be this one. This is the incarceration rate for non-violent drug offenses in the United States in the wake of the war on drugs. This is really, you know, you can think of the cost as about 500,000 people per year at a cost of anywhere between $50,000 and $80,000 per year. So you can do the math in your head. That has, you know, that's not the policing in the community, the judges, the lawyers, all the costs associated, the parole, everything that's gone along with that. This is actually sort of a mirror image. This is the federal drug control budget. It's actually a 520% inflation-adjusted increase in the amount of money being spent. Just absolutely astronomical. And what you would expect, because the focus of this has been on supply reduction, you would expect that if this was effectively reducing the supply of drugs, you'd expect that the price would go up, you'd expect the potency to go down, you'd expect availability and rates of use to go down. And actually, if you look at the government's own data, you can see in the blue line here that the price has actually gone down dramatically because of increased supply. The potency of marijuana, this is US government data, has gone up dramatically. So these huge investments in locking people up have not achieved their stated objectives in terms of reducing the availability of marijuana. This is something from the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, which is sort of the scientific arm of the US government that's really responsible for researching drugs. They're very conservative. You can imagine that, you know, they have to be very careful in terms of what they say. But if you dig through their reports, you see that they conclude over the last 30 years of cannabis prohibition, the drug has remained almost universally available to American 12th graders, with approximately 80 to 90% saying the drug is easy to obtain. So these huge emphasis on supply reduction, when by every metric, it clearly has not achieved its stated objective. And then, of course, we're here to talk about unintended consequences, which is a huge issue. And this is a fairly typical sort of prize photo where you see this on the news or on the cover of a newspaper. And there's always three things in these photographs. There's drugs, there's guns, and money. And I'm always very careful to say that I don't want to be critical of my friends and colleagues in law enforcement who put their lives on the line to try and improve community safety. But there will inevitably be a police officer there saying, yeah, we've improved the situation in the community by taking these drugs and taking these guys out. The reality of the situation is that it doesn't work like that, as I'll soon describe. 2009 was an interesting time for me. I was working as a resident physician at Vancouver General Hospital. I used this as an image to show how bad things got in 2009, although there's probably a 2010 entry. I don't know, the actual rate of homicide has continued to go up. But it was real front page news in 2009, and I was working in the emergency room, and on 3 occasions in 1 month, people were brought into the emergency room who had been shot. And I just couldn't believe it. Like, this is happening everywhere. This is the time people may remember where someone's girlfriend was shot while her kid was in the back seat. And I was walking home after being on call one night, and I saw the cover of the Vancouver Sun, which said that 2/3 of British Columbians would legalize marijuana to reduce gang violence. And it was because of this Angus Reid poll from 2009. And I almost fell out of my chair, because I'd been working as an inner city medicine physician where my research and clinical practice is largely focused on HIV/AIDS. And we have interventions for the treatment of HIV that are extremely effective, proven effective in randomized controlled trials, but public opinion data trends around 55% support for that. And here, without any credible scientific voice really pushing this notion, the public is already at 2/3 support. And I don't know very many things that 2/3 of British Columbians can agree on, but already 2/3 agree on this. And I really was intrigued by this, and I wanted to sort of wade into this, but I always try to be very evidence-based in my discussions about things. So I don't know, this audience, probably not too many physicians here, although I've been introduced to by a number, but some of you will not know that there's a hierarchy of evidence in medicine and public health, and at the top of that pyramid is something called a systematic review. It's when you take all the evidence you can from every published study, and then you try and draw some conclusions from it. And that's exactly what we did here, led by a grad student from my lab named Dan Werb. Greg Rowell is actually the head of the UBC library, so he's someone that's very good at doing these searches because they can be quite technical. Gordon Guyatt is actually a guy from McMaster who coined the term evidence-based medicine and helped some of these systematic review techniques and how they can be replicated. To make a long story short, there is no scientific study that has ever shown that drug law enforcement reduces violence. And there's a whole host of literature to show how when you go into a drug market and you take out key players, that creates an economic opportunity. And there is no recourse to lawyers or others, so people will fight to gain and maintain market share. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the community. Hence the birth of Stop the Violence BC, which David Bratzer, who you'll soon hear from, made a really huge contribution to. You're not meant to see the names here, but just to make the point that this is a coalition from people across the political spectrum: law enforcement, chief prosecutors, former judges, physicians and public health experts from all major universities in BC, UVic, SFU, UMBC, etc. Our goals are very simple. We're trying to start a public education campaign focused on 3 things: the failure of supply reduction, the harms of